Hi, can everybody hear me? Thumbs up. Yeah, fantastic. So thank you everybody for attending, and Happy New Year. I know I've got some apologies from Dan Johnson, Tracy Braymond, Jamie Stone and Stephen Timms. So sadly they can't be with us today, but they're invariably here. We've got one bit of housekeeping. We're still looking for a member to represent those excluded by the 50k ceiling on the SAYS. So I'm wondering if anybody wants to represent that group, if they can put their hand up or get in touch with the APP Secretariat sort of later on. So that is supporting those excluded by the 50k ceiling. And what we've got this session is specifically looking at the Directors' Income Support Scheme, a policy proposal put forward by Forgotten Limited, Federation of Small Business, ACCA, and the Re-Legal Consulting. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later on. We've got key representatives from those various groups, and at the end there will be an informal vote to ask who wants to support that scheme going forward, the DISS scheme going forward. But first of all, we're going to hear from Caroline Lucas, who has been working very closely on this scheme, who's been supporting Forgotten Limited throughout. I know she's been also working with the Treasury on this and really trying to make sure that this is a scheme that they do accept. I do know at the moment they're meant to be actively considering this. I know it made the newspapers just before Christmas, so they are actively considering this. So Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Esther. Really appreciate that very kind introduction. I was only going to just say a few things, and really I was going to start by reflecting that actually there's some good news that from 6 o'clock on the 21st of January, a dedicated limited company directors support scheme offering financial support to company directors who've been personally adversely impacted by COVID-19 will open. That's the good news. The bad news is that you're only eligible if you live in Northern Ireland. So that is cruel and unfair, but also true. Last week, the Department for the Economy in Northern Ireland did what we've been asking the Treasury to do for months now. And they did finally recognise that directors of limited companies have been wrongly excluded from other support schemes and that they need a package that reflects their unique circumstances. And I guess I would simply say that if it can happen in Northern Ireland, then it can happen here. And thanks to Forgotten Limited, Rebecca Seeley Harris, the FSB and ACCA, together they have drawn up a scheme that is quite similar in its aims to the one that company directors in Northern Ireland will be able to use. As Esther said, it's called the DISS, the Directors' Income Support Scheme. And while the Northern Ireland package isn't as generous as we'd like the DISS to be, I think it does simply show that bringing directors in from the cold is perfectly possible to do if the political will is there. So for months, the Chancellor has denied that many company directors even did fall between the self-employed scheme and the job retention scheme. And he's asserted that dividend income somehow isn't proper earnings. He's wrongly lumped them together with the self-employed and claimed that pretty much the only people not getting income support during the pandemic were millionaire footballers. And when he couldn't finally hide behind that any longer, he started to kind of malign limited company directors as somehow being tax dodgers. And I think it's really important to point out that he is willfully choosing not to recognise that many are forced into setting up as limited companies in order to get contracts. And that's particularly the case in the public sector, for example. It's pretty much essential that you do set up as a limited company if you want those contracts. And of course, people do then dutifully pay their corporation tax as a result. So I think one of the things that we're really struggling with is that government simply isn't recognising that small limited company directors are our nation's entrepreneurs, and that 7.6 million people actually rely on them for their jobs. Now, the Treasury's current stated objection to supported limited company directors are around the risks of fraud and they say that checking the paperwork will be too onerous. Other schemes giving people income support have allowed individuals to self-certify. In fact, our whole tax system is pretty much based on being able to self-certify. So there's nothing strange about that in terms of the DISS proposal that is being put forward. Directors simply want to be able to do the same as everyone else is being able to do. They want to be trusted as others in our tax system are trusted. And the Treasurer's last letter to me either willfully or accidentally ignores that the DISS proposal is based on a company's taxable profit, not on dividends. So in other words, the information that the HMC needs is already available to them. It's held by HMRC. So the risk of fraud is minimal and certainly no greater than anywhere else in the tax system. So the bottom line is that if the government wanted to put this kind of proposal into practice, then every obstacle that they've put up so far can be readily overcome, just as it has been in Northern Ireland. And I think our challenge today and going forward is effectively to demonstrate that the hurdles that are being erected simply aren't real ones, and that we can certainly answer the concerns that the Treasury has put up. And that starts with fully understanding the DISS and why it's right and fair to urgently campaign for one. And for that reason, I very much welcome this meeting.
Caroline, thank you very much indeed. You spoke very eloquently about what we're aiming to do and what you have so comprehensively done. Now we have got, even though I've said it myself, a stellar panel that has been put forward for today's meeting. And we're going to start with the head of technical advisory for the Association of Chartered Certified Accountants. So if Glenn Collins could start today's discussion on DISS, and we'll take it from that. We've got two other speakers after that, but Glenn, if you could start.
Hi, and thank you very much for the kind invitation coming through. As a professional body, we have looked at the issues raised by a number of directors and self-employed, some of which are our members, but actually a lot of those are businesses our members represent. And it was, as you rightly say, a series of discussions going through where issues were raised and put up in respect of dividends. And we didn't see, along with others, why we were going down that particular route, which is why DISS is different in its overall makeup and overall outcome. So with DISS, we've established that in a way where we look at companies' profits. We focus it on directors who are working within their business who would otherwise have little chance of being able to avail themselves of the job retention scheme. And that's why we put in the persons of significant control within there. And we focused it on information that actually is held by government departments going through. As a check, you know, there is a piece of declaration where we're saying one claim per directorship. We're looking and making sure that that is undertaken and can be applied through. So it is focused on directors falling through within that regime. The certification is, as Caroline rightly points out, an issue where it is often raised as a potential barrier, but taxes are self-certified within the UK and have been for an awful long time. And each of the proposals to date put forward by government rely on an element of self-certification going through, be that a business is in trouble, has been impacted by coronavirus, or that actually you're making, if you look at mainstream taxes, you're making a declaration through about your income and all of its sources running through. So we have very much built in that information based around what is held by government. So if we want to go into that in a little more detail, I'm obviously happy to do so, but I'll just give you a, that was just a brief overview of perhaps the self-certification and actually the feedback from an awful lot of businesses, which I know you've gathered going through, which are desperate to hear about some support being offered or available to them going forward.
Glenn, thank you very much indeed. Now, I've got three members of the panel who are going to speak, and what I thought, it could be easiest if we hear from all three, and then if everybody on the Zoom has questions, put your hand up or put a message in the chat box and I'll go straight to you, because I thought if I hear from all three panelists, some of those questions might either have been answered or it could provoke a follow-up question. So if I bring in the next panelist, which is Rebecca Seeley Harris, and she's founder and former senior policy advisor with HM Treasury, Office of Tax Simplification, and also Legal Consulting. And I know she's put in a huge amount of work on this and fundamentally doing it in a very selfless way for other people. Even though she's one of the 3 million, she might not get help or support, but she's put all her time into this. So huge appreciation there for what you've done. So Rebecca, if you take the floor, explain what it is you want to add in here, and maybe a little bit more about yourself. I don't know.
Thank you, Esther. That's very kind, and thank you, Caroline, as well, for that very good introduction to the Directors' Income Support Scheme. This was brought about, as Glenn said, because for the sort of 8 months before we started looking at the Directors' Income Support Scheme, everyone had been looking at dividends, which for me is incorrect, because everyone keeps saying, the directors who pay themselves in dividends. That's not an appropriate sort of sentence, really. Directors pay themselves salaries, and it's a very well-known structure that they would pay a salary, and then out of the profits they would pay themselves a dividend. We have to bear in mind that these types of companies don't necessarily have, a monthly paycheck. They get money in as and when the invoices are paid, so they don't really know what their profits are going to be, and dividends have to be paid out of profits. So you can't have any kind of regularity with it. So that was where we first thought, well, let's look at something else. In talking to Gina Broadhurst from ForgottenLTD, deciding actually that a proper policy was needed. My take on it, because I used to be a senior policy advisor, my background is I work in off payroll and IR35, so I know the self-employed sector very, very well, and also the limited company sector very well. So in talking to Gina, I thought actually the best thing would be to try and help the government. And I'm not sure whether this has been done before, that a member of the public, as I am, I suppose, thought, well, if we actually give a very detailed policy to the government, then they've got something to work on, and that makes sure that we get their attention, but also hopefully that there is some kind of solution. So if I look at the finer details of the policy, we are basing it on the CT 600, which is Corporation Tax Return, and based on trading profits. These are figures that HMRC already have, so there's no real need for self-certification. And I know that in some of the letters that have been written, that the self-certification is a problem for the Treasury. Well, that's not a problem. The self-certification only becomes an issue, which is exactly the same as SAYS, when the director has to make a statement that they have been adversely affected by coronavirus. Also that they are still trading and that they will continue to trade. So that self-certification is exactly the same as SAYS, which the Treasury have already accepted. That point also is the reason why we chose to base it on SAYS, because it is the only existing scheme that the government already have in place that allows the person to continue working. That's really important, because with the furlough, the directors were allowed to use the furlough for their salary, but that only meant that they had a very, very small income from the coronavirus grant, which was about £500 a month, which you can't really live on. So when we're looking at the CT 600, We do technically have to add in the director's salary, because the director's salary comes out before the profit. So to make it equal to SAYS, we would have to add the director's salary back in. But of course, that's an option for the government. That's not necessarily, we're just suggesting it. The whole scheme is based on providing the Treasury with options. So we're not saying that there has to be a 50k cap. We're not saying it has to be 50-50, but we are mirroring it on SAYS because it is the existing scheme that's available. The eligible individuals would be, as Glenn's already said, the executive working director, or the government could choose the person of significant control. Again, that is all very well documented, and that is information that the government already has. So there's no need to self-certify that because it's already in the system. This will mean that the grant is open to companies that have more than one director. And I know that it was reported recently in a lot of papers, actually in the Sun, Daily Mail, Telegraph, that it was for sole directors. It's not for sole directors, and that was done quite deliberately, because there are a lot of companies where you have maybe a husband and wife team who are joint directors, but they are both working in the company, so they both deserve the support. So the eligible individual would have to be perhaps a person of significant control. As a director, they also have director's duties in law. So there, I think, is more of an emphasis on their legal duty. And from a fraud point of view, you know, a self-employed person doesn't have any formal legal requirements, whereas a director does. And as you rightly said, the tax system is based on self-certification. The self-assessment, which everyone fills out, it is self-assessed. So hopefully the basis of that scheme is something that the government could work with. It would be open to between 946,000 and 2 million actively trading small companies. So what needs to be understood is obviously that is more directors. So in the 946,000, and I know it's been reported as 700,000, but that's not correct figure. The figure currently is 946,000 non-employing companies that are assumed to have one working director or one sole director. But you could have up to 2 million actively trading companies that would have more than one director. So there are a considerable number of these limited company directors who could benefit from this scheme. And as I've said, with the self-certification, they have to make a statement that they are actually have been or are being adversely affected by COVID-19. So hopefully the scheme is workable. It's a very sensible solution, and we are hoping to hear back from the Treasury very soon.
Thank you very much indeed there, Rebecca. Obviously, our next speaker now is Craig Beaumont, Chief of External Affairs for the Federation of Small Businesses. As you can see, the scheme that has already been put forward, the DISS scheme, is following a very logical process, is following a template that is already there for SAYS. So that's sort of why perhaps it is getting this sort of active consideration at the moment, and why it is so important to support all these people. But I'm bringing Craig in now, and then questions afterwards to probe this a little bit more. Craig, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Esther and Caroline. So you probably know who FSB are, 165,000 small business members and self-employed members. So the two key groups in our membership, and every MP on this call that's helped us has a group of a few hundred of those want to engage. I thought I'd just add a couple more details to both those presentations. The first is that to go back right to the start, when the government came out with the furlough scheme, which was huge and amazing and astonishing and changed the debate. You probably remember that it was CBI were quite high profile, saying this is it, this is amazing. We were not so loud because we were behind the scenes talking to Number 10, saying, hang on, self-employment, you always forget self-employed. So we went in and lobbied our heart out. You know, we lost everything on the field to fight for a self-employment support scheme. Now, of course, unlike with Rebecca and Glenn's kind of authored piece of a full policy proposal, we were doing normal lobbying, which is, here's the problem, here's what we'd like to see, but we weren't designing the scheme. Didn't get very far. There's been no There's been no movement beyond a couple of changes on pregnancy and armed forces with the self-employment income scheme, but they haven't answered the problems, even for those two groups. So when Gina from Forgotten Limited, who is a total legend, came to us and said, well, I'm thinking about setting up a working group. I've got Rebecca, I've got Glenn, would you join it? We could not have been more eager to take part. So we brainstormed what would happen. Rebecca's proposal was astonishing. What was really clever about this scheme is that it's not about dividends. So we saw a number of ministers telling Parliament, well, dividends is too difficult. And, if that's, that was the main reason. Now we've created this very elegant, very clever scheme which answers that problem. So if this government does not say yes to the DISS or a form of it, if this government has to come up with a new reason as to why it doesn't back it, that is going to be really key, because it actually means finally we will have confirmation that the group of people that won't get help is an intended group. They intend not to help them. And that is a horrible place for a government to be of any colour, let alone a Conservative one, of course, as well, that prides itself on being pro-business. So having got through that genius, we sent in the proposal on the 19th of November from the four of us. We met the Financial Secretary, Jessie Norman, on the 9th of December with a full hour, a big meeting, which was actually really positive, and a number of officials were listening in to that from Cross Treasury and HMRC. But it's now been quite quiet. We sent in some follow-up information. Sorry, Rebecca actually sent in the follow-up information after the meeting, and we were told we'd hear in January. There was an inference of slightly early January, but we're now on the 19th. So really, I was hoping for this group to think about ways that we can add the pressure on, and that is both politically through PQs, raising in debates, as you normally do, but also in the media. So The Sun had a great article that we took part in, where they had sources in the Treasury saying it absolutely was coming, which is probably too far along the spectrum to be true. But then the Treasury briefed out that it was perhaps under consideration, but not likely, which I think is at the other end of the spectrum. The truth is somewhere in the middle. And if we can kind of shift that towards the more positive end of the spectrum, that would be so good. And it would be a real legacy of this group if we could do that. And then just finally, I was going to add, this is one pocket of those who are excluded. There is no scheme, we think, no idea that will work, that will just give thousands of pounds to everyone across the 3 million. So we would love to see extra work done on each pocket of those people who are excluded, using this DISS model, using this kind of fully worked out, outsourced policy, and whether that could actually get some difference for each of the other pockets. But it's not an either or, it's very much a and. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much in there for that. Thanks for that. We've got Craig, we've got Glenn, we've got Rebecca. So if I can just see, has anybody got their hands up? Would anybody like to have some clarity on any of those points? Anybody want to come in? Okay, I've got Tim there, followed by Munira. Tim Farron.
Thanks, Esther. No real clarity other than to say I think this is exactly what we should be doing. It's perfectly legitimate for us to challenge the government for not having provided for any of the excluded groups through this time. But as they have been reluctant to make the changes we think are just so justly, obviously needed, I think coming up with a hard, well thought through, expertly designed proposal like this is exactly where we should be, not just with regard to directors, but some of the other categories of those that have been excluded and are outside support, because it then gives the Treasury something they then got to respond to. And if they want to come up with an amended version, then we're all ears. But I just think this is exactly where we should be, because it's a positive, proactive thing to do. People have put a lot of effort into this, and it certainly stacks up to me, and let's all get behind it.
Thanks, Tim. I know I'll be taking a vote at the end if everybody's happy to put this forward, and I'm taking that as a yes there from Tim. So, Munira, your points?
Sorry, I think I wasn't putting my hand up. I was trying to play with something, but yes, fully supportive. And I guess what would be helpful to know is, just as you're having those discussions with Treasury, what are the key stumbling blocks? Because that can really help sharpen, you know, what work we're doing in terms of PQs and challenges we're putting into government.
So it's a bit like an auction, isn't it? Don't put your hand up if you're not wanting to buy. Don't raise your hand to unmute just in case you get called in for a question. So I think those are good points there. Where should our questions be focused? Where should, or whether that's written or spoken in the House? So I think that's looking at maybe, Rebecca, what you see as the sticking points, or maybe Glenn or Craig, what are the challenges? What would you recommend? If I start with you, Rebecca.
Well, I think actually, I mean, this is on the wider scope of what the government's attitude is towards these limited company directors. Because of the off-payroll IR35 legislation that I work in and have worked in for 20 years, I'm very well aware that, you know, that legislation is coming in April as well. So these limited company directors are really being affected if they are going to be affected by that legislation as well. So I think one of the questions is a wider question of what is the attitude towards these limited company directors, that the government isn't immediately trying to support them with this proposal.
I don't know, Glenn, if you want to come in on either that point or another point, something we should maybe be aware of, ask questions on.
I think the main stumbling block for government is rightly around fraud, and actually the possibility of fraud running through. We have obviously built this particular proposal with that in mind, and so we've addressed fraud in a number of different areas, including different options for elements of certification, but actually also concentrating on information that the government holds already and actually has within its remit. So the checking and verification process is actually nothing that isn't actually held on public record, or sorry, not public records, but held by government records, be that profits or be that the public record for persons of significant control. So the area I would concentrate on would be actually what difference or what risks, added risks, are actually presented by this, which are above stays or above self-certification in general. And I thought Caroline's summary at the beginning was absolutely marvellous around that tax self-certification.
I'm bringing Caroline in right now on the back of that. Your hand's raised, Caroline. Is a point you want to bring forward?
Well, I was only going to quote from the letter that I got back from the Treasury on the 12th of January, because to me there's a real question. I mean, to be generous, maybe they are misunderstanding. To be perhaps rather more realistic, maybe they're deliberately choosing to misunderstand. But what the Treasury letter back to me on DISS says is that they are actively considering it, but then it goes on to say it's clear that DISS is intrinsically reliant on self-certification by owner-managers of companies, which we've already discussed, because HMRC are unable to verify dividend or directors' remuneration amounts or to whom they are paid. Under current reporting mechanisms, it's not possible for HMRC to distinguish between dividends paid in lieu of employment income and those paid as returns on investment in the company. And it goes on to say the effect of this this reliance on self-certification is to open up to unacceptable levels of fraud. And you know what we've all heard from the last sort of half an hour is how that response is completely inappropriate to the reality of the case we're putting forward. And I know Rebecca has offered to give us all, and I think perhaps the Secretariat might circulate to us, you know, the strongest form of attack back on those lines, because either they're willfully misunderstanding or they genuinely misunderstand. I don't know which it is, but if we all were really, really clear in the best ways of countering those arguments and demonstrating that they are simply not well-made challenges to this scheme, then I think, you know, they're going to have to come up with something else. You know, as I think Craig said earlier, you know, what is their real objection to supporting this group of people? Is it, you know, just some kind of ideological reason for not doing it, which is very hard to understand given that these are the wealth creators of our country, or is it something else? I don't know. But I think, you know, having the really strong arguments against this couple of paragraphs, which I'm sure will find its way into all of the letters that we get back unless we can really challenge it.
Well, can I pose another question to the panel then? If there were a further check that government would want these companies to do, whether it's a further audit, is that necessary? Is that required? Or would even asking that of this group of people show there is a difference between them and everybody else?
If I can jump in there. I'm very aware of the letter that Caroline and what the Treasury has just said, and I have to contain myself to not say the words I really want to say, because it is completely incorrect, and I have no idea why the Treasury are coming back with that line. Dividends are completely irrelevant to this scheme, and that's the whole purpose. And the whole question around dividends is completely irrelevant, and in fact, it's giving a public perception that in some way these directors are some kind of tax dodgers because they're taking dividends. Yeah, I will be writing a rebuttal to that letter in the near future, so we can actually go back to Treasury and explain again why that is incorrect.
But by the mere fact of asking for another form of checks or balance to this group of people, asking for a higher bar for them to pass would show, in a way, a form of discrimination against this group. So I don't know, Glenn, do you want to come in on that point?
No, I would agree with that. I mean, our preferred route is for that self-certification that we actually have in place already for SAYS and others. So that is our preferred route going through. We have put other options in there, but they are, you know, that's not our preferred. That is just showing across to government that there are other routes of certification that they could look at if they felt that the risk was too great for them. We don't see that risk as being too great for them, but we've included those in there for completeness running through.
Has anybody else got a question for our panel there? If not, it could be there we have, we've got Peter. Peter Grant's got a question there.
Thanks very much, Esther. I suppose the two questions I wanted to pose are, how do we propose to work the communications around this to make it clear to 50-odd million people who don't really understand what's going on, that we're not talking about government subsidies for tax dodgers and millionaire company directors. I do find it somewhat ironic, the political persuasion of the ministers who are telling us that anyone who owns their own business is immediately a tax dodger, but that's maybe a discussion for another time. But I think when you talk in principle about small businesses or small family businesses not getting supported, the public sympathise with it. As soon as you talk about company directors or company shareholders, the public image is still of these are all people who've got yachts in the Bahamas. And that is the image that the government are quite obviously trying to project. So one thing that we need to be careful about, and Rebecca referred to earlier on, we need to be very, very precise about the language, and we need to take every possible opportunity to explain that the companies that we're talking about just now are the one individual who does electrical repair work, and for reasons that may be to do with protecting his mortgage in case the business goes down, they've set it up as a limited company rather than simply as a sole trader or an unincorporated partnership. So these are people who, to all intents and purposes, financially are in just as bad a position as an employee whose company isn't able to provide them with work. Picking up on the comment about whether or not HMRC have got the information, I don't care if HMRC think they've got the information. Companies House have got it. Most of the information that you need, if you had time, you could actually crawl through the Companies House website for every company in your constituency and make a pretty accurate guess or pretty accurate conclusion as to which are the ones where the only people working in that company are the 1 or 2 directors who are also the 1 or 2 shareholders and possibly a member of their immediate family. It does mean that to do it in an efficient way, it would need to be done by data matching rather than by a manual process. Every couple of years, the DWP run a data matching exercise across the whole public sector in the United Kingdom that is now up to, what, 50 million bits of data can get matched a couple of times a year in order to catch fraudsters. It's ludicrous for the government to claim that it's not realistic to do a data matching exercise on 5 or 6 million bits of information in order to give money back to people who should be getting it. So the technical arguments that are being put forward are simply not true. I think I know the words that Rebecca was trying very hard not to use when she described those statements, and that description would be absolutely correct. And the ministers who are making these statements cannot possibly believe they're telling the truth unless they've been very, very badly briefed indeed. And it seems to me that we can certainly all agree in the principle that there's a substantial number of people there who deserve to be getting financial support just now and who can't. And looking at the outline of the scheme that's been proposed, an outline, yeah, definitely I support it. I don't think we should get hung up in the details just now. I don't even think we should be saying this is what the scheme should look like. I think all we need to say to the government is, here's an outline of a scheme that can work, that can be made to be fair. Why don't you set out the details? The final comment on the risk of fraud, absolutely, and I think we have to be very clear that if anything like this scheme was adopted, there would be a degree of fraud. There's a degree of fraud in everything. We don't stop the benefit system because some people attempt to defraud it and some people get away with defrauding it. We don't stop concessionary rail travel or blue badges because some people abuse the system. You make the system as fraud-proof as you possibly can, and ultimately you accept the fact that it's the only way to protect 3 million people from financial destitution is to accept the possibility that 4 or 5 people, maybe 400 or 500 people somewhere will make a bit of money on the side. That might be a level of risk we have to take. But when you look at the willingness to accept the risk of fraud that is applied to a lot of the other COVID support packages, when you look at the lack of due diligence that's been done on some of the contracts that have been given out to big companies for tens of billions of pounds, it is a bit rich for the government or HMRC to say they can't introduce a scheme such as this because there might be a risk of fraud that comes to a fraction of the levels of fraud that they've already accepted in other schemes.
Peter, thanks very much indeed. So for the panel, it is that sort of perception, how businesses are portrayed, verification of the facts, and also a degree of fraud, which, as Peter said, we know that happens in other things and you don't stop it because of that, but you will diminish it as much as you possibly can. I'm not sure who wants to come in first.
I've got a couple of points actually, which Peter's raised some really interesting points there. First of all, the point on limited liability, that a lot of our self-employed people are trading without any limit in their liability. So if something goes wrong, they could in fact lose their family home. That is why, one of the reasons why people incorporate, because a company is a limited liability. And it falls in that for very good reason. There's lots of other reasons for enhanced credibility. So you can't often get a contract. And actually, it used to be the case that you couldn't work with the government if you were not limited. I think that's now been removed, but the point is that you can't get these contracts because you have to have the credibility of a limited company. So all these people have set up these companies in good faith. My concern is moving forward is the attitude towards these limited company directors, that they're tax dodgers. I don't think a government should be saying that to those people in the economy that are probably going to take us out of COVID-19. From my work when I was at the Office of Tax Simplification, there are a proportion of companies that are labelled tax motivated incorporations. So I'm not sure whether that is some of the reasoning behind the attitude towards them, but it shouldn't be happening.
Thank you.
and I just wanted to add a couple of points to Peter's points. The point about small businesses rather than company directors is really key. We actually thought about this, and we tried to make as many case studies as possible. It's the human stories that are really emotional and I think incredibly convincing and gets over that barrier. So, you know, your hairdresser, your wedding organizer, actual people that you know who are in trouble. And I don't know if, you know, I found on my Facebook a lot of people who are company directors that I had no idea. And bear in mind, this is what I do for a living. So, you know, it really brings it home. It's in everyone's community. The bit about Companies House, the slight difficulty I have with this, you know, of course they have all the data, is that this system rests on data that we know they hold and in a systematic way that they can administer easily. So effectively, what I totally agree, they could do all sorts of things. But the thing that's attractive about this is we've made it deliverable along their own criteria. So if HMRC can administer this easily, then it answers one of the potential questions they could hit us with. You know, we would love it to be backdated at the start to get proper parity. Is that going to happen? Well, maybe not. And if maybe not, what is our reaction if they offer, you know, a DISS grant for alongside SAYS grant for? You know, that we won't be happy because that's not everything we want, but it's still good. And then finally, the thing about the, you know, we should make the outline and let them do the data and the policy analysis. That hasn't worked. We've had 10 months basically of shouting and being cross and being annoyed and making the case for what's missing. So that's why on this one, we think this is the game changer because we've done the work for them. I know it's play school, but it's, you know, Rebecca's work, Glenn's work, so impressive. And if this gets across the line, we've done something that no one's ever done, I think, ever before in public policy. And I think we should be proud of that.
Glenn, do you want to add anything, or should I? I know I've got a couple of questions.
I think Craig has summed that up really, really nicely. So I would just leave it with that. I would just say we do have that PSC piece which sits in there, which really directs this particular policy at those smaller businesses running through, at those businesses that are affected, at those businesses that are also employers and actually are making those tough decisions around their employees going forward as well, going in the future. So I would just leave that with Craig's excellent and eloquent point.
Right, so I know I've got Rebecca, Craig and Sammy, and I'll take the points and questions in that order. Rebecca?
I'm sorry, I didn't have my hand up.
Oh, okay. I got a message you wanted to ask a question, so apologies for putting you on the spot. Sorry about that. Shall I go to Craig then?
No, I'm the same, but thank you very much.
Okay. It's like name and shame here, isn't it? Calling people out whether they want it or not. Sammy, do you wish to come in? Sammy?
You're on mute, Sammy.
Can you hear me now? No.
Yeah. Oh, you've gone. Sammy, you've gone.
How's that?
Good.
Brilliant. We've never been able to shut you up before. Amazing.
You've explained the mechanism by which you believe those who should be eligible can be filtered. And I think that I would agree with Peter that no system is foolproof, but I think that you have provided the means by which fraud can be minimised in all of this. Maybe I missed it, but I'd be interested to know what you see as the kind of level of compensation or level of payment which you would expect from the government. I mean, in Northern Ireland, we actually took it out of some of the money which had been given to support businesses through COVID. There was a £20 million cap. The amounts are not all that generous, but nevertheless are designed to try and give people some support. And we think that we have put in place sufficient criteria to make sure that most of the cases which are dealt with are genuine cases. But I'd be interested to hear from you. Do you think that there, first of all, there should be a cap on the earnings that you're dealing with? Secondly, what kind of levels of compensation would you be expecting from the government, or have you any proposals on that? So that at least would it vary across different businesses? Would it be a one-off payment, a set payment? Maybe you could give us some details on that.
Thanks, Sammy. Should I go to you first, Rebecca?
Yes, I wanted to say first of all, thank you very much, Northern Ireland. It's amazing that you've come up with these schemes, the two schemes, newly self-employed and the limited company director scheme, which I believe is launching soon, as Caroline said. So leading the way, brilliant. You know, gives us good evidence to go with. The DISS scheme is based on I've forgotten. Oh, it says Marine Says. So because that's the only one we can really look at. So it's 80% of the it would be 80% of the trading profits. Sorry. So that would be there's the cap on the earnings. It's actually the same as Says, because we wanted it to be on par with the self-employed. We didn't want the limited companies to have, you know, they shouldn't have an advantage. They should just get the same as the other self-employed people.
Glenn or Craig?
Yeah, I was just going to add 80% of trading profits up to 7.5k per 3 months to be in line. Again, it's another reason why to get this thing to the best possible moment for the government to agree it, we've gone with the government's guidelines. So of course people would want more, but that seems right. The Northern Ireland scheme is really interesting. I know you work closely with FSB NI. They were talking to the government there about the creation of this scheme, and it's a grant after the fact. It's not through the tax system. So we can still have the DISS in addition to your scheme up in Northern Ireland. Obviously that would be interesting interaction. But the difference with the 1k one-off grant, which has no assessment on earnings whatsoever, which is actually great. But at the same time, you know, if they're worried about getting money to those who need it without fraud, you've got £1,000 going to everyone. And so that's really interesting. And that won't be happening through the DISS, but it would be in addition to the DISS for the UK.
Can I just jump in with a very quick comment that the money does go into the company. So this is it's not being given to the individual, so it is taxable. So the government will get something back from this.
Twice, won't they?
I think that's a good point to make there. Yes, thank you.
And I suppose the other point is that if the £20 million is not used up on the £1,000 grants, then it has been agreed that the money would then be divided amongst those who had been counted as eligible. So there could be a top up to the £1,000 as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, look, you know, that's been a good discussion there on the DISS scheme, and I did want to take an informal vote of the MPs here. You know, are we supporting it? Is this something we want to pursue and continue? So if we can have a vote, if you want to put up your hands. And if the Secretariat could count this, I think it's looking like all of us. I think that's unanimous there. So that's what I call a positive meeting. Now, is there any other questions, any further points anybody wants to add in? If not, we can end a little bit early. But if there is anything, maybe, I don't know if Caroline, if you want any closing words there, or anybody else want to come in?
I'm fine, thank you. Just to thank all of our speakers again. I think it was really, really clear, and look forward to taking it on to the next step. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely endorse that, and I think all the panelists do. It was very clear indeed, and again, a huge thank you for all the time that you've put in to help
those excluded businesses. So if I call this to an end, you will get an email when our next meeting is, where we're up to and what we're doing next. Thank you all very much indeed. Meeting closed.